Hi, everybody, and welcome. My name is Brenda Romero, and I'm the game director of Empire of Sin. And I am absolutely thrilled to be able to talk to Daniel Okrent, who is the author of this book, which was actually part of our research for Empire of Sin. Tell me how you first become interested in Prohibition.
Well, my previous book was about Rockefeller Center and how it came to be, really a book about New York in the 1920s and 30s. And I was writing a chapter about how the Rockefeller interests acquired the land leases to 228 brownstone buildings in the center of Midtown Manhattan. And I went to the city records and they listed the price that had to be paid for these ground leases. And this building was $900, $1,800, $1,500, $80,000. And this is really strange. Probe further into the records, I saw they were speakeasies. And speakeasies were very valuable properties in New York in the late 1920s.
Right.
I thought, whoa, Prohibition, that's a subject for a book.
For me, I grew up in northern New York, right on the Canadian border. So there was a place, there was a bar called The Place, which never shut during Prohibition. And so as a little kid, I was probably 10, I'd say at the time, I was quite curious about why it never closed. And so I asked my mother. And my mother was a pretty devout woman. She certainly didn't want her kid knowing about how people might look the other way, including the law. And so she kept not answering me. I don't even remember what she said, but what she did do is set off this lifelong fascination with Prohibition in criminal empires.
May I ask what religion your mother was devout in?
She was Catholic.
The greatest supporters of Prohibition were Methodists and Baptists, who were against drinking in any form inside their own churches. Catholics and Jews opposed it almost universally. And wherever there was a large Catholic and or Jewish population, that's where Prohibition really was able to thrive without secrecies.
I'm interested, there was a story that you were talking to me about the church's role. Obviously, at the time, you were still allowed to have wine as part of your sacraments.
There were 3 exceptions in the Volstead Act, the enforcement law, that allowed people to have some access to alcohol. One was home production for your own use. That was done to make the farmers happy. The second one was a medicinal excuse, so that doctors could prescribe alcohol to their patients for any number of bogus diseases. There was a very big business in it. The third exception was for religious purposes, and this was done, in fact, partly in a way in an effort to buy off the Catholics and Jews and Episcopalians and others, who used wine in their sacraments.
Sounds to me like there was a whole lot of sacraments going on.
Oh, people were so religious during that period.
Prohibition, it's threatened, hasn't started yet. It was not obviously a good thing if you liked a casual drink on the side.
In the beginning, when it was finally established, when it was clear how the law was going to be enforced, one commentator said everybody was happy. The dries had their law and the wets had their liquor, because there was no problem getting it if you wanted it.
So Prohibition had an incredible effect on organized crime. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Organized crime before Prohibition in the U.S. was a local business. You would find in every city and even small towns a local gang that controlled usually a district in town that was a red light district where there was gambling, where there were no closing hours for bars, where there might have been the distribution of drugs.
Yeah.
But once you had Prohibition, you had to deal with the shipment of hard goods from one place to another, barrels or bottles of wine to get from one place to another. And Chicago was the only major gang-controlled city that wasn't on either the Canadian border or the Atlantic or Pacific coastline. The liquor would come through the rail tunnel from Windsor, Ontario to Detroit, and then the Detroit mob would ship it on to Chicago. And as these networks spread throughout the country, there became the realization we have to get together. We have to protect territories, set prices, end the gang wars between different cities. And they came together to create the National Crime Syndicate that stayed with us for at least 50 years. It all came out of Prohibition.
Wow. Yeah. So before Prohibition, there's little fiefdoms of gangs. but Prohibition is what really brings everything together.
That's right. It takes a disparate group of mobsters of different ethnicities. In this town it was Irish, in this town it was Jewish, in this town it was Italian, in this town it might be black, or at least in this part of town it might be black. And it brings them together in this great kind of United Nations of gangsterism.
So in Empire of Sin, we have a variety of rackets, businesses that the bosses might get into. For instance, we have brothels, we have casinos, we have obviously speakeasies. And then we have breweries, which is allowing them to build the alcohol. Did mobsters set up businesses themselves so that they could distribute their alcohol to the people who might drink it?
There were any number of ways to setting up a business that could be a front for the distribution of alcohol. Laundry delivery trucks could be used for it. Pharmacies, big trade in pharmacies, much of it legal because of the exception in the Volstead Act. Dean O'Banion operated, his front was flowers for funerals. Any number of businesses actually survived Prohibition and prospered after Prohibition because of it. One of them was funeral homes.
I was just going to say, yeah, that gets to Daniel McKee Jackson.
Funeral homes had storage space, they had refrigerated storage space, they had parking lots, they had vehicles. And in fact, not only somebody like Jackson in that business, but some very respectable businesses grew out of that so that after Prohibition, those assets could be used for different purposes.
But Capone had a statement that he was just supplying what people wanted. He was just giving the people what they want.
That's right. And Capone recognized that if he was giving his liquor to the people who made the decisions and who ran the town, he was entirely safe. And he talked about how he would send liquor specifically to the homes of the wealthy and the powerful for their parties. Say, it's okay if they do it, but not okay if I do it. He was a pretty good businessman.
One of the resources of Prohibition, one of the most important ones, is alcohol. So if it was illegal, where's it coming from?
Yeah, there were three primary sources for the alcohol.
Right.
Number one was across the Canadian border. Number two was along the Atlantic coastline, from the tip of Cape Cod down to South Carolina, actually into Florida. And then the third, and really the largest form, was the conversion of industrial alcohol into potable alcohol. Everybody was involved in it at some low level. But at the top of the pyramid were those who were distributing the liquor. And that's where the mob and the Chicago mobs come in. The Jenna brothers, are they in your gang?
They are indeed.
They owned the near west side of Chicago by giving small pot stills that you could put on a countertop in the kitchen to hundreds and hundreds of Italian families who lived in that neighborhood and paying them $15 a week to distill alcohol for them.
I think it's important, the economic impact of this, especially because we are heading into the Great Depression, as Prohibition is going on. And so I think the economic impact of this, when you're talking about this extra money to line people's pockets, would have been more important than ever.
In fact, this leads to the end of Prohibition. In 1929, the market crashes. The Depression soon follows. So the federal government is no longer collecting. They're collecting 2/3 of the income tax that they usually collected and not a penny of capital gains taxes from 1929 to 1933. The government is running on fumes, and somebody says, I've got an idea. If we got rid of Prohibition, we'd be able to tax alcohol again, and voila, it would be done. So between 1929 and 1933, there's a total change in the political environment.
Okay, so I think we can call it there. And Daniel, it was genuinely an honor to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing this with us.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.